Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Passing the CIPTV1 300-70 Exam, webinar number 2 of the CCNA CCNP Collaboration Webinar Series, hosted by Fastlane and presented by Joey DeWheel. First, a few housekeeping items. All attendees, please leave your audio on mute to prevent any audio interference. We will be taking questions in the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen during the presentation, and then at the end, Joey will answer all of the questions that are not covered. Also, the slides and audio recording will be emailed out to all attendees within the week, so please look for that email from Fastlane Training. Now I'm going to hand the presentation off to Joey.
Thanks, Lee. Thanks for that introduction. And welcome everyone to Understanding the CIPTV1 300-070 exam. So this is a webinar. We're going to look at what you need to do to pass this exam. Okay, so this is the first exam on your road to the CCNP collaboration certification. There's 4 exams: CIPTV1, CIPTV2, CAPS, and CT Collab. Passing any of these individual exams also extends any other certifications you might have by 3 years. So if you have your CCNA Collab and you pass one of these 4 CCNP tests, that certification will be extended for 3 more years. Okay, many find the test difficult, but it's not so hard if you know what and how to study. And we're going to talk about this in this webinar. Okay, the CIPTV1 course, which you can take from Fastlane or another learning partner, helps a lot, okay, but it doesn't have all of the answers. The Foundation Learning Guide, which the full name's listed there, I'm just going to say the Foundation Learning Guide in future, full name, Implementing Cisco IP Telephony and Video, Part 1, Foundation Learning Guide. That's not going to be available until September. These learning guides are normally a repackaging of the student guide from the course. So the content of those 2 things will be roughly similar. So these 2 things will help, but they won't have all of the answers. Okay, so you need to broaden what you look at to study, or you're not going to pass. Okay, to pass, you need to know what's on the exam and what material to study. You need an effective study method, and you need to allocate the time required given your background and experience. Okay, we can't give you the answers. This isn't a webinar where I go through all the questions that are on the exam and tell you the answers. What we're going to try to do here is help you get organized and increase your chance of success. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about the blueprint, okay? Let me just call up a marker here or a pointer. There we go. So we're going to talk about the blueprint, and these blueprints, which you can find on the Cisco at Learning website, are vital to your ability to pass the exams. So you want to go and find the blueprints and make sure you study the material indicated there. Finding the blueprint is the first step, but then after, you have to try and figure out what material you want to study, and you want to figure out how to find those study materials. You need an effective study method, and you need to allocate the right amount of time. So we'll talk about all 4 of those things, all 4 of these things in this webinar. Okay, first thing is what's on the exam. And I'm going to just pop this link. Let me just grab it and pop it into chat so that you've got this link and you can follow along. Okay, so hopefully you've got that link. You can click on it. You can then navigate to this page, and you find a complete description of the exam. We've got an overview tab here. We have the blueprint, and again, this is vital, the exam topics. We have the study material, and we have some practice tests. You want to review this very carefully. This is the key. to passing the exam. Okay, so here's a little look at the blueprint for CIPTV1. So we can see the topics listed here on the left, from dial plan down to configure media resources. Then you can see the percentage of test questions that are associated with the topic. So from this we know that dial plan is going to be a quarter of the exam, whereas the QoS portion is relatively small at 8%. Also, once you're done with the exam, okay, whether you pass or fail, you're going to get a score result that indicates what percentages you scored on each of these individual topics. Okay, if you look at the Cisco Learning community, there are questions and there are threads on these exams. And here's a response to Cisco, or from Cisco, to questions about the CIPTV1 exam. And this goes to the issue of where does the content come from. So all exam items are mapped 100% to the blueprint. We're going to look at the blueprint. The courses, labs, and guides are additional materials to assist you in studying and preparing for the exam, but are not a guarantee that knowing that the CIPTV1 or CIPTV2 or CAPS course, knowing the content in that course is not a guarantee that you will pass the exam. Now for CIPTV2 example, for example, for that exam, the course, right, and the foundation learning guide are really not adequate at all to pass the exam. For here, for CIPTV1, the course is much better. It gives you much better coverage of the content of the blueprint. And I'll discuss this later, but you're well advised to focus on the material in that CIPTV1 course. However, that's not going to guarantee you that you will be able to pass the exam. So you really need to study the blueprint. So dial plan topics, individual topics. So what I've done is I've expanded dial plan. We see that 25% of the test will be on the components of a dial plan, CUCM calling privileges. So we've got partitions, calling cert spaces. You need to know, a route patterns, point to route list, point to route groups, point to devices. It could be a gateway or a SIP trunk. You need to know all of those things. You need to know how the dialed number analyzer works. You need to know about SIP route patterns. You need to know about normal route patterns, right, telephony route patterns. You need to have all of that down fairly well. And we'll come back to this when we look at what should I study. But again, the point here is questions could show up from any of these individual topics on the exam. Another 21% focuses on cluster calling. And in fact, it says on cluster calling here, but that's not really correct. This should really be labeled as off cluster calling, on cluster and off cluster calling. If you're doing on cluster calling, you don't have route patterns, right, pointing to route list to gateways and so on. You may use translation patterns for this, but you definitely need to understand off cluster calling to be able to pass the test. So again, we have a list of subtopics, and if you look at this, we have 21% for configuration of, and this is really dial plan configuration. So 21% here is discussing dial plan configuration. 25% here is covering the dial plan. So together that's 46% of the exam is on dial plan. So that's the piece that you really need to know the best if you have a hope of passing this test. Okay, also on the test we have questions about the basic operation and components involved in a call. Okay, that's only 8% of the exam, so you don't have to worry about that too much, right? But you surely need to know something about codecs, G711, G729, H.263, and H.264. And so on. You don't need to know about every codec ever devised, but you need to focus, right, and understand the major codecs. Configuring an iOS gateway, you need to know how to do that, right? So you need to understand dial peers on a router. You need to understand class of restriction, which is the equivalent to the communications manager class of service. You need to know about voice translation rules, and you need to know about prefixing digits, right? All of that kind of thing. And you need to understand about Cube. So you need to know how the Cisco Unified Border element is configured, right? And particularly relevant to video. And you need to know what Cube does at sort of a high level. Again, this is for 16% of the exam. You need to understand conferencing, and this is a grab bag of conferencing, so you need to understand iOS gateway configuration. You need to understand configuring a conference in the communications manager. You need to know about telepresence server, telepresence conductor, right? You need to know about the video capabilities that we have with these servers, in addition to understanding call manager native conferencing configuration. There's a small section on QoS, and we'll talk about this a little bit in more detail later. Okay. Media resources. We need to understand about things like MTPs, transcoders, conference bridges, music on hold servers. The title here is media resources, but it does poke in here configure IP phone services. So we also would want to know, for example, how you would configure a phone service such as extension mobility. Okay, so that was a quick look at the blueprint. And again, I showed you where to find the blueprint. We sent you a link to that just a moment ago. And that is the first thing that you need to understand. So I recommend that if you're going to take this exam, the very first thing you do, go to the link, look at the blueprint, go through that material and say to yourself, how much do I know about these things? Okay, so having identified the blueprint, the next question is, what am I going to study? What book am I going to get? What PDF am I going to download? What ebook am I going to subscribe to learn the material that I need to know to pass the exam? There's many topics on the exam, right? There's many different kinds of documents. There are SR&Ds, deployment guides, administration and maintenance guides. There's the foundation learning guide that's coming in September. There's different versions of the products. The course itself is focused on the 10.5 version of Communications Manager, but other study material references the 9.x SR&D. So you can expect that you'll get questions from both Communications Manager 9, Communications Manager 10. Any questions on those two versions should be legitimate. Okay, we're going to help you get started here. So the first place to look is Cisco at Learning, and what do they say you should be studying. So I've gone to the overview here of the CIPTV1 exam. This is hard to read in the slide. Okay, recommended training, but again, I've given you a link to the page, right? So you can go to this page with that link, and you can find this information, and you can see that there's a recommendation here that you take the CIPTV1 course. And this has pretty good but not complete coverage of the material that you need to know. We have a link here, Cisco Technology Training for Collaboration e-learning. Unfortunately, that link is broken. I sent an email to the people looking after this pointing this out, so we'll have to wait and see if that gets fixed. There are Cisco Press books that you can pay for. Now, if you go to that link, there are no specific Cisco Press books identified. There is going to be the Foundation Learning Guide available from Cisco Press. That would be a good book. We'll talk about what you might want to do for study materials in more detail in just a few more slides. So there's more guidance at the Cisco at Learning website, Learning at Cisco. So we see study materials. So for each of these exams, Cisco lists some materials that you can study for each of these topics. And now, at the moment, this is not very comprehensive. So you're not going to be able to go to these web pages and find this is what you need to study. There are some suggestions, but at the moment, it's really up to you to try and figure out, where do I find the study material to understand what I need to know to pass the exam. So we looked at what Cisco recommends for CIPTV1. Okay, some of the sections in that tab, study materials, refer to this product, the Cisco Unified Communications Manager 9.x series e-learning product. That's offered by the Cisco Learning Network. You need a premium subscription to access that content, and that comes in at $11 a month. Okay, so we looked at that actual document, we looked at that e-learning product, and unfortunately, this is really a number of Cisco engineers explaining the software architecture of the Cisco Unified Communications Manager and the inner workings of its components. So I found this fascinating. It would be great if you were going to do your CCIE, and probably good for the CT Collab exam, but I would not recommend this as a study tool for CIPTV1. It's basically a lot of block diagrams on a whiteboard with information as to, inter-process communication and this software architecture. So while this is a good product, is it appropriate for you to use to study for CIPTV1? No, it's not actually a useful study tool. There's no configuration information. It is a very deep dive on the software architecture. The only other study material referenced is another Cisco e-learning product, establishing an on-cluster call with Cisco Call Manager. I don't think you need to pay or be logged in to have a look at that. And it's not a bad product, but unfortunately, it's based on Call Manager version 4.1. Okay, so here we have a screen cap for those of you that have been around that long. The Call Manager 4.1 GUI had a whole different sort of color scheme, a little bit different look and feel. So I would not advise going back that far in time to study this material. So it's useful and interesting, and it helps with general content, but really focusing your study on a 4.1 product when we're actually at 11.5 is just about to come out. So we've come a long way from 4.1. Okay, so other than the CIPTV1 course, we really have nothing useful that's recommended in our opinion. So just to be clear, I have taken this test. I passed this test. It's not as hard as, for example, CIPTV2, but you still need to figure out what to study. You need to identify the study material, and you're going to have to spend the time that you need to get that blueprint sorted out so that you can pass the exam. So the first thing that we're going to look at is study material for the dial plan topic And this topic, describe and configure Cisco Unified Communications Manager to support, and again, this should be off cluster calling or on and off cluster calling. So this is 46% of the exam, and this is really mostly about route patterns, translation patterns, digit manipulation, your dial plan hierarchy, route pattern points to route list, points to route group, points to gateway or trunk, partitions and calling search spaces, understanding the wildcards in route patterns. You need to know something about communications manager groups, right? And you're going to have to know what device pools are all about. Okay, so this is what I would describe as basics. When I teach the CIPTV1 course, I tell people, if you understand the dial plan, and as part of the dial plan, it's the route patterns, then you have your dial plan hierarchy, which decides which gateway to route out, and then you have, and part of that is what digit manipulation to do, and then you have class of service or partitions and calling search spaces. If you understand the dial plan, then you've mostly figured out the communications manager. So this is your number one task, is to figure out how these things work. Same thing for the exam. This is 46% of the overall content. So let's just step back and ask ourselves, what kinds of documents are available? How can I find them, and how useful are they? So we went to Cisco at Learning, and we discovered that there's not a lot of material that they're pointing us to. So we have to go and look and find this stuff ourselves. Now, I'll say right away, the CIPTV1 course student guide is the best place to start. It maps reasonably well to the blueprint. Again, it does not guarantee you that you can pass this exam. There's going to be a foundation learning guide, right? And these foundation learning guides, in a lot of cases, are kind of a reformatting of the corresponding course's student guide. So what we can see in CIPTV1, in the CIPTV1 course, should also be in the Foundation Learning Guide. Now for CIPTV2, where the Foundation Learning Guide is already out, this was mostly true, but not completely true. So there was some mismatch of content between the course and the Learning Guide. But for the most part, these things overlap fairly well. Now, this learning guide won't be available until September. So if you're in the situation where you don't want to take this course, or you've taken CIPT1, right, and you just want to move forward to the CIPTV1 test, if you don't have access to the student guide, you have to wait until September in order to get the Foundation Learning Guide. But there's other official documents we can look at: SRNDs, admin, deployment, feature and service guides. There are Cisco Live presentations that you can find and look at, and there's a lot of unofficial material. If you go and search in YouTube, Cisco dial plan, right? Or if you just search for Cisco dial plan in Google or Bing or whatever, and you look at videos, there's a lot of basic information on YouTube that's actually quite good that you can have a look at. The best place to start is the CIPTV1 course student guide, and that's where we recommend you focus your attention. So the very first thing you should do is understand the student guide from the CIPTV1 course. If you haven't or can't take the course, then what are you going to do? Well, for now, you kind of got two options. If you need to pass quickly, right, you can have a look at the last version of the Foundation Learning Guide. This is the Foundation Learning Guide for the previous version of the CIPTV1 course, which is CIPT1. Okay, it's old and missing some content that's going to come in the new document in September, but it still has a lot of excellent content that's identified in the blueprint, particularly concerning the dial plan. So if you can't wait until September, this is a good option for you. Purchase this book or the e-guide. In September, we should have the actual Foundation Learning Guide corresponding to the CIPTV1 course. So you can just hold out a little bit if you like and wait until September to get this book. There are a lot of great Cisco Live presentations, okay, and you can access these here, right? https://ciscolive.com/online/connect. I should have a link for this. I'd like to paste this into, I don't want you to have to write these out, so let's just find the link and paste it into chat. I have the link, and I pasted it into chat. So you may have to set up an account to gain access to the presentations, but there are an awful lot of useful presentations here of the intro variety or overview variety. Here's how to get started with X. So something that you can look at. Okay, we went and had a look in here, and I've been to a number of these presentations, particularly on the dial plan topic, and we would recommend these Johan Krohn presentations. And you can go back to 2015 is only last year, right? 2014, most of the material in these presentations from 2014 is relevant. Go back to 2013, 2012, if you like. The dial plan has a lot of commonality across the last few versions, but this is something that we would recommend you look at from 2014, Enterprise Dial Plan Fundamentals. That's from Cisco Live 2014 in San Francisco. And we could see the agenda here, call routing basics, call cert spaces, translation patterns, and so on. So if you're looking for free stuff, right, not everybody wants to pay, you know, hundreds or thousands of dollars to buy materials to study for these exams. Here you go. There's some material in the fundamentals presentation, and there's also an advanced dial plan presentation. So that presentation was quite good. I was at that one live in 2014. The first presentation calls out sections of the 10.x SRND, the Solutions Reference Network Design Guides. The SRND is your friend. That's a quote from Johan Krohn. So that's not my quote. He says the SRND is your friend. I happen to agree with it. So some of this material from the 10.x SRND is called out. It's very useful to run through this material. Look at the Cisco Live presentations first, then go to the SRND and see what you can figure out from that path. The SRND is a heavy document. There's a lot in it. It could be hard to use as a starting point, but the better you get to know the SRND, you know, the more chance you have of passing these exams, and the more useful you're going to be at work. So the SRND is your friend. Download it and get familiar with the content. There's a good recommendation. Some of these topics, so if you go through, I said the course doesn't cover everything, right, that's on the exam, and it doesn't. So for example, describe VCS calling privileges, rules, classes, services, transforms, search rules, and zones. There's nothing really in the course, and so I imagine in the Foundation Learning Guide either when it comes out on that as a topic. Modify, analyze, and document a dial plan. Well, the course certainly talks about modifying a dial plan, but it doesn't go through analyzing a dial plan, for example. So how to use the dial number analyzer. That's a tool that's a part of the communications manager. You better read up on that. Document a dial plan. I'm not actually sure, to be honest, what that's really referring to. So I didn't study documenting a dial plan. Remember, you've only got so much time. You can't learn everything. Manage your time. All of this is on 25% of the exam. So you can't spend 3 weeks learning about VCS calling privileges, right? You can't spend a week trying to figure out documenting a dial plan. DNS dial plans are not configured inside of the CIPTV1 class or discussed. DNS dial plans, if you look at this, the only thing that supports all 4 of these different kinds of dial plans would be VCS and Expressway. So when you're looking at this, what this tells me, if I'm trying to figure out what to study is, well, I need to know the call manager dial plan really well, but I also need to, understand a little bit about the dial number analyzer. I need to know the basics of VCS based on how much time I might have available, and I should know something about at least the different kinds of dial plans. So I might want to look up what a DNS dial plan is inside of VCS, even if I don't want to go into that much detail on that specific content. Some other topics here. Describe the basic operation and components involved in a call. So this is only on 8%. So if you look at what you have out there to study, outside of the courseware itself, I'm not entirely sure what I would recommend for this. And given that we're looking at 8%, my approach in this last exam was just to assume that I knew the basics of this enough to get 1 or 2 questions right. Certainly, you want to have a basic understanding of codecs, G711, G729, wideband, the audio codecs. You want to know a little bit about video codecs, H.263, H.264, and so on. Right? It's only natural that you should understand something about codecs, given that that's what VoIP is all about, right? But remember, manage your time. This is only 8%. Configure an iOS gateway. So an iOS gateway, or if you're configuring Call Manager Express, you would have the same sort of requirements to configure digital voice ports, dial peers, do digit manipulation, prefix digits, voice translation rules. On the router, configuring call privileges is core, class of restriction, so you should know something about that. Show and debug commands under verify dial plan implementation, so make sure you understand what show commands there are to show you what numbers will match which dial peers, what debug commands exist to show you what dial pairs are being matched by an incoming call, right? Both incoming and outbound. And you should know something about Cube. I did find that the CIPTV1 course was weak on this material. And, that could pose a problem given that it's about 16% of the content for the course. So you may want to try and supplement that with some additional study material. Now, I went and found this. And again, let me find this link and paste it into chat. There you go, which has a lot more detail. Now it's a little bit heavy going. It's a configuration guide, so some of it is is tough reading, right? So what you really have to do is kind of go through it, skim, and then call out some of the more important things. Configuring dial peers, what we have for wildcards, how dial peer matching works. That's covered in the book. Look at digit manipulation and class of restriction, and then you really should be looking up some show commands and debug commands. Okay, and this is basically the document I just sent you a link to. Okay, dial peer configuration on voice gateway routers configuration guide. I basically just did a search for Cisco iOS voice gateway configuration guide basic. You could do a variety of different searches, but again, when you're looking for material, you've got to go back to the blueprint. So you can Google or Bing or Yahoo search whatever, configure an iOS gateway, and then look through your search results and try and find something that you can work with that's going to provide an overview and that will help you to understand the details here. Okay, so we've discussed this. Configuring conferencing devices. This is a hard one because configuring these different devices is not discussed in any single document. That should read CIPTV1, so that's actually a typo here. So sorry about that. That's CIPTV1 student guide. So you really are looking at here configuring conferences using iOS gateways. So we can have an iOS gateway do voice conferencing, or it could do video conferencing, and as well you can put a conference resource directly on the communications manager. So you've got communications manager, and you've got in conjunction with that your routers, your iOS gateways. But in addition to that, we have the larger video conferencing server. So you have to know something about the telepresence server, which is the actual MCU, right? The media convergence unit, the conferencing device itself. You have to know something about telepresence conductor. This helps manage a set of telepresence servers to facilitate conferencing. Global conference settings, you want to go into the enterprise and system parameters and find whatever global conference settings there are and understand those. Okay, in addition, there's this particular product, the MSE 8000, right, and various subsidiary products. You want to look that up, right, and have a basic understanding of that conferencing product to match the questions that might come on it. But again, right, 5 subtopics, right, 11% of the total exam, right? So you're looking at, 6 to 8 questions on the 5 topics here, right? So you could find 1 or 2 questions from each of these topics. You can't learn everything, right? Manage your time. QoS model. This is another piece that's not that large. So again, manage your time, and you have to understand what diffserv is. And certainly, if you're going to learn about diffserv, you should understand the difference between diffserv and intserv, integrated services at a high level. Describe markings based on class of service, right, which is layer 2, and DSCP and IP precedence is layer 3. Distinguish where to configure layer 2 to layer 3 QoS mapping. policing and shaping, and justifying the requirement for QoS when implementing video. So, what did we do? Again, this is one of these situations where the CIPTV2 course, it has a half day on this to go through the overview. That's a great place to start. But what if you don't have the courseware at hand? What are you going to do? Well, think about it. This is actually something that we did for CIPTV2, so that is not a typo. We started with the basics. We went to cluster-wide QoS parameters, and we just had a look at what's configured here, the DSCP values for audio, for video, for telepresence, right, to be sure we understood the actual values for calls that are being made. If DSCP values are important, you should know some basics, right? Our assured forwarding settings, AF11 corresponds to DSCP10, so we can look at interactive video. AF41 corresponds to DSCP34. We should know some of these basics, and don't forget about EF here, expedited forwarding. From the 10.x CUCM SRND, look, you need to know in not just CIPTV1, but if you're looking after the communications manager, this basic diagram is important. For immersive video, we're using CS4. For interactive video, we're using AF41. For signaling, we're using CS3. For audio, we're using EF, right? So these basic things you should certainly have a grip on when you're going to do the exam. What else should you study? Well, again, already mentioned that this should be again a CIPTV1 course. So sorry, a couple of typos here. The CIPTV1 course has the content you need to study, and that content will be in the Foundation Learning Guide when it's available in September. Okay, the Collaboration System 10.x SRND has a section on QoS, so it won't hurt to go and have a look at what's in there. And you can look at the QoS SRND at the overview sections inside of that SRND to get the basics on these things. What is policing? What is shaping? What is differentiated services? And so on. But again, remember, it's only 8% of your exam. Manage your time. Media resources also configured in the CIPTV1 course and covered, right? We have labs for that and coverage in the course, so a good spot. The SRND is another good place to look for a discussion on media termination points, conference bridges, music on hold servers, transcoders, and so on. So there's a couple of places to go and have a look. Again, you don't need to do a huge deep dive, but there's 11% of the exam will be on these topics. And don't forget phone services. It's not a media resource, right? So we have to assume that although it says media resource here, that you may have some questions on IP phone services. Okay, so let's just finish off here. We've only got about 15 minutes left, including Q&A. So study methods, the first thing, the question here is, how should I study? So we talked about the blueprint. You need to know what's on the blueprint. We talked about trying to find the materials to study, and we said, look, if this is your first priority, and it's not so easy to find the material you need to study. But once you've found that, what is it that you're going to do to study it? Right? There's many ways to study. So you can read and reread, and for some people, this is enough. I know people whose memories are so good that they just have to read the material a couple of times and they remember it. For me, I used to need to reread things a few times, but now that I'm older, I need to reread things 10 times if I'm going to remember much of it. So, that's an option, but it only gets you so far. Take notes and summarize. So we'll talk about crib notes a little bit later. Practice, right? So if you've access to practice, a lab that you can use to practice, that's useful. CIPTV1 is a lot simpler in terms of the virtual machines you need to deploy to build your own lab. It's much easier to build a practice lab for CIPTV1 than it is, for example, for CAPS or CIPTV2. And then there's practice tests or practice questions. Read and reread. Okay, this may be a good first step, but it's problematic as a complete solution. Take notes and summarize. We'll talk about building crib notes. We used crib notes to pass the CIPTV2 exam, which is much harder than the CIPTV1, and we're building crib notes now for CAPS, which is the next exam we're going to be looking at. So that's something that we've done. And I built crib notes for CIPT1 when I took that many years ago. I haven't explicitly built crib notes yet for CIPTV1 for this exam, but that's something that we're planning on doing and incorporating into our fast lane courses. Okay, so we're not aware of any CIPTV1 practice labs other than the actual CIPTV1 labs. Okay, so we don't actually believe the CIPTV1 labs gives you enough skills by themselves to pass the exam. So the lab itself, it's useful, right, but it's not the be-all and end-all to get it to the point where you can pass the exam. You could possibly try dCloud. It's a little bit problematic for something like CIPTV1 because you really need something set up as a learning environment where you can configure a dial plan. You can build a CIPTV1 home lab reasonably easy. It's relatively easy, I should say. It's much easier than what you would need for CIPTV2. There's no actual practice labs out there really that you can get to that are really cost effective. There's some practice questions. Okay, the Learning Network has 10 practice questions, and I would advise you to run through them. However, getting 100% on these does not mean that you're going to be able to pass the test. There's practice questions in the course, and there will be, I'm assuming, in the Foundation Learning Guide. If you've got access to the courseware, you should do those questions. That's a good place to start as well. You can search the internet and you can find many practice tests, and this is a natural thing for people to do, right? When I was at university, I would look at older exams for practice questions. If you're doing your LSAT or MCAT, right, the first thing you would do is start downloading practice tests to run through them. But for Cisco CIPTV1 practice tests, the ones you find on the internet, they're not approved. Okay, you're only allowed to use approved Cisco material for studying. Using them to prep would be considered cheating if the questions on those tests are copies of the real test questions. And as well, you won't have the job skills that are necessary. So, I've had students say, well, what about taking these exams, these practice exams, brain dumps? Some people innocently subscribe and download them and then find that the questions are exactly the same as what are on the exam. So that's not really right. We're not advising you to do that. We're telling you here none of those brain dumps or downloads are approved. And and it could be considered cheating, right, if you download these and the questions correspond exactly to what's on your real exam. Crib notes. So we started building crib notes, and we've really been doing this aggressively for CIPTV2. For CIPTV1, I've just started looking into this, and we will come up with something that we're going to add into our CIPTV1 course delivery. So we'll put some crib notes in there that help you to summarize things like configuring a dial plan, for example, or configuring dial peers on the router. So, I mean, the idea is to indicate what the tasks are, and for an individual task here, call out special things that you might need to know, put it on a page of paper, and get to the point where you can remember the content of the page of paper and actually fill it out from blank or from scratch. Study efforts. How much time should you spend preparing? Well, it depends on your background. Okay, if you don't know the CUCM dial plan well, if you do know it, then you have a very good start. If you don't know it well, then you have a large effort. Man weeks for sure. This is not something where you can take the Foundation Learning Guide, or you can take the course, right, and study it for a week. As a CCSI, as an instructor, I used to tell people, you've got the course, spend a week studying it, take the test, you should do okay. It doesn't work that way anymore. The course is not good enough, right? So you first of all have to spend the effort to really understand the dial plan well. And then that will take man weeks if you're a beginner, right, and you don't really understand this. If you do know the dial plan well, then you've got things like video conferencing that you're going to have to really come up to speed with if you're not familiar with that. There's some effort on router configuration if you haven't done a lot of that in the past. So you're looking at man weeks to prepare to pass this test. It's also difficult to know when are you ready, right? Because you can't download a practice test and run through it and see, did I get 100 or did I get 40? Excuse me. Excuse me. Yeah. So it's difficult to know when you are ready. You almost have to allocate the time, run through the blueprint, study to the point where you think you understand these topics, and then take the test and see what happens. It's not an embarrassment to fail. It is common for people to fail these exams. I failed the CIPT1 exam the first time I took it when it came out 4 or 5 years ago, and I had been delivering the course for years, and other instructors were in a similar situation. I know of at least one instructor, very competent, who's taught these courses for years and who did not pass the CIPTV1 exam on his first attempt. So, it's difficult to know when you're ready. These exams are not trivial or simple in any way, shape, or form. Okay, a little summary. The 300-070 exam, it's the first exam on the road to CCNP collaboration. We looked at the blueprint and study materials. We talked about some study methods, and we talked a little bit about the effort required. So, this is not a presentation to say, here's how to pass the exam, because we don't actually believe we can produce such a presentation without giving you the questions and answers, right? But what we hope we've done is helped you to understand what's on the exam, to get organized for studying, and to prepare for the exam. We have a couple of courses here at Fastlane, and we're actually updating all of the courses at Fastlane to include exam prep content. So this is a Fastlane value add. We're going to add into these courses a review of the blueprint, and we're going to start including, how to find the material, how to build some crib notes, and some practice and study techniques. So we're including these into our courses. First course here, CIPTV1 Bridge. This is basically material from CIPTV1 excluding the dial plan piece. So imagine that you understand the call manager dial plan really well, and you want to pick up the extra material from CIPTV1 covering, for example, video conferencing in Cube, for example. Well, there we go. There's a 2-day course focused on the new material, and this is the basic 5-day course. And again, we're supplementing this with value add for how to prep for the exam, what's on the exam, and so forth. Okay, so here's the enhancements. So I've talked about this. We're adding this exclusive exam prep content to our courses. Thank you. I went a little long, so we should get right to Q&A. If there are any questions, let me have them at this point, and I will answer them right now.
Hey, Joey, we do have a couple of questions that came in through our chat. The first one is, do you recommend waiting for the Foundation Learning Guide to be available?
Yes, I actually think that you've got a much better chance of passing this exam if you either take the CIPTV1 course, in which case you then have the material itself, or if you wait until the Foundation Learning Guide comes out, that will have the material that's in the course in it, right? In the learning guide. So if you can't afford the course, if your company's not going to send you on the course and you want to get that material in a cheaper format, that's the Foundation Learning Guide, and you'd be best to wait until that comes out in September.
Terrific. And we do have a little bit more time, so I'll give a few more questions. We had a couple come in asking, what order should the 4 exams be taken in?
That's a good question. That actually came up at the Cisco Live presentation in Las Vegas last week. The way to take these exams, CIPTV1 is the first one. Then you can take CIPTV2. Then you can take CAPS, and then you can follow that with CT Collab. You could change the order of CIPTV2 and CAPS around. It's not so important that you do one first or the other. But what I would do is CIPTV1, CIPTV2, CAPS, and CT Collab. In fact, that's the way that I'm organizing myself to study and pass this round of these tests.
Okay. And lastly, what's that now?
No, go ahead.
Last question, can I build a home lab for study purposes?
You can. For CIPTV1, because a lot of the material is call manager specific, you don't need a lot of VMs. You don't need your own C-Series server to deploy a lab. So you can deploy a lab with a couple of call manager VMs. You can use one as a simulated PSTN and the other as your enterprise server. You can use IP communicator and a couple of cheap phones, and you can get 60% of the content you can get to work in a reasonably inexpensive home lab. But you need to have the installable ISOs, right? So you would have to be able to get those from work.
All right, terrific. So thank you, everybody, for attending today's webinar, and a big thank you to our presenter, Joey. So thanks, everybody, and I hope you have a great rest of the afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.